I ended last time talking about the encounter between Mr. Brooke and Digley, and it's one of the most best known scenes in Middlemarch. But another one concerns Brooke. Brooke forced to scuttle off, as Digley put it, um, and when he gives his maiden political speech, and he's mocked by this puppet effigy of himself that mimics his words, echoes his words back to him. Um, so it's interesting because Mr. Brooke here is really being used to register seismic historical events. Big changes are happening, um, and um, it, Mr. Brooke is like the most direct vehicle for registering these historical changes. So it's kind of interesting that Brooke himself is such a kind of non-entity. I mean, his unexceptionalness is underscored by his compulsive repetition of himself. Um, he is like a copy of himself. One of the best known literary critics of all time was basically Marxist critic that wrote in the early 20th century. And he's best known for his book called The Historical Novel, um, and where he really delves into this question of what history is, what it means to represent history. It's sort of what I'm suggesting Eliot's after too. So in the historical novel, Lukács argues um, prior to the French Revolution, the consciousness of history as such wasn't really developed. I think that's really interesting. We're so obsessed with drawing historical distinctions, and as time's gone by, um, it's only accelerated, right? We like every new um, generation seems like is shorter and shorter. So what distinguishes the historical novel, according to Lukács, is that it foregrounds mediocre characters, average, typical characters like Mr. Brooke, in order to show how they're shaped by larger historical forces. So, what moves the plot is the historical force, the historical change that's expressed through the characters. It's interesting to notice in this scene where Brooke is mocked by the puppet of himself, that how much he's already referring to repetition or imitation. Before the puppet even appears, he's talking about precedents for himself and just sort of vaguely listing them off. If I wanted a precedent, but we never want a precedent for the right thing. But there is Chatham, I can't say I should have supported Chatham or Pitt, the younger Pitt. He was not a man of ideas, and we want ideas. His language is so repetitive it kind of dissolves into nothingness, like it is as if everything he has to say already. So Eliot is showing Brooke getting satirized here by hecklers, but she's thereby also herself satirizing politics. Um, the inanity, the empty mechanical repetition, conformity, reduction of conversation to slogans. So blast your ideas, we want the bill, that a heckler says. And then that also is repeated by the effigy. The laugh was louder than ever, and for the first time Mr. Brooke, being himself silent, heard distinctly the mocking echo, but it seemed to ridicule his interrupter, and in that light was encouraging. So he replied with amenity, "There's something in what you say, my good friend." So he's having this conversation with the puppet. And what do we meet for but to speak our minds, freedom of opinion, freedom of the press, liberty, that kind of thing. The bill now, you shall have the bill. Then he's heckled, "You shall have the bill, Mr. Brooke, per electioneering contest, a seat outside Parliament as delivered, £5,000, 7 shillings and fourpence." So the punning on the bill as a bill of sale, and I think that's pointed, because what Eliot is, I think, calling into question is the way in which politics homogenizes social life and social conversation, debate, and identity into a generic currency like money. Um, and this is really well written, I think. Then came a hail of eggs, chiefly aimed at the image, but occasionally hitting the original as if by chance. So brilliant, I think, hitting the original as if by chance. So the image has taken priority over the original. The original is beside the point. Commodification of personhood. And again, it's not as if Brooke wasn't already self-commodifying in his inanity, perpetual self-repetition. But Eliot here is depicting the political spectacle, the way in which politics, as we're so familiar with now, becomes a theater, and the spectacle takes priority. The theater takes priority over any kind of genuine conversation. I think Eliot is critiquing this commodification in the epigraph to chapter 51. It's really brilliant, and it relates to, she uses Darwinian language here of genus and species, and I think she's harking back to the idea that you might remember from Darwin, that there's no such thing as species. Everything is unique. Everything is individual. Species is just kind of an averaging out, but nature is organized around the pursuit of diversity. The most successful species are going to be the ones that exhibit the most diversity, the most variety. And so Eliot's expressing some concern here that, like money, politics homogenizes life. Party is nature too. So politics is like nature, she's suggesting. But as the poem goes on, she draws out the distinction. Party is nature too, and you shall see by force of logic how they both agree. The many in the one in many. All is not some, nor some the same as any. Genus holds species, both are great or small. One genus highest, one not high at all. Each species has its differentia too. This is not that, and he was never you. Though this and that are I's, and you and he are like as 1 to 1 or 3 to 3. This is not that. He was never you, even if you're on the same side politically, if you're both I's. And you're as like as 1 to 1. You're never the same. Each species has its differentia too. There's a bit of a wordplay going on here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3. It's also the case, he was never you. If there's a you, then there must be an I, right? So that's like first, second, and third person. I, you, and he. There must be a speaker that's referring to you and referring to he. So that makes 3. And 3 is sort of built into experience, past, present, and future. It's a way of talking about history that I've mentioned before, that history is always about working through contradictions in culture, thesis and antithesis, moving on to the stage of synthesis. This is, best known in terms of the Christian Trinity as a way of synthesizing the thesis and the antithesis between eternal and mortal, divine and human, the infinite and the finite. These antitheses are resolved in the figure of the living God, the Jesus Christ. Going back to this idea of the sort of a grammar, an arithmetic of experience, past, present, future, that we're always counting through these categories in a way, first, second, and third person. I mean, isn't that sort of what Brooke is looking at here? First, second, and third person. He's himself, he's the original. He's getting mocked by this puppet. But what's getting negotiated in this mockery, in Brooke's self-representation and then his opponent's satirical representation of him, is a third thing, which is the norm. What Brooke means as a public idea, Brooke's identity as a public idea, is what's getting contested in the opposition between the original Brooke and the puppet copy. And there's a saying in Italian, non c'è due senza tre. You can't have two without three. I think that's pretty intriguing. The way I make sense of it is, for a thing to be a thing, as we say, for a thing to become a thing, it has to happen twice. It can't just happen once. If it's a one-off, that was just random. Who knows what that was? But if it's only after it's repeated that you can say, that's that thing, it happened again, so that's the thing it was, right? But once you have two, you have the original and then the repetition. You must have a third thing, which is the norm that underlies these two instances. You have the substance, you have the meaning that's expressed in these two particular instances, right? So you have one instance, one example, a second example. Now that's become a thing of which we have an idea. So when it happens again, we can say it's another further instance of that idea. So you can't have two without three. You can't have one without two. You can't have one without three. So the way I'm reading this, maybe overreading this, is she's elaborating this, everything that's lost when we treat everybody as one, reduce everybody to indifferent examples of a political party, all of this rich differentiation. This is not that. He was never you. So she's not demonizing it, but she's pointing out an important dynamic of representative democracy, homogenization. The whole of Book 5 begins with another great poem about commodification, about the commodification of women in particular. And it's very reminiscent of this famous poem by Robert Browning, My Last Duchess. It's a monologue. It's in quotations. Like, Robert Browning is famous for these dramatic monologues. And it's about turning women into artwork that you can own. So look at how My Last Duchess begins. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. So this is a widower talking about his late wife, talking about a painting of it's as if she were alive. The painting captures what was alive about her in a way that he owns now and controls in a way he didn't when she was alive. As the poem goes on, you hear that he was prone to jealousy and resented that she did not respect and obey him as thoroughly as he wanted, not unlike Cosman. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily to turn her into this object of ownership, just like the dead hand. Casaubon's will is explicitly an assertion of patriarchy, like My Last Duchess, and that we can see that registered here in Browning's poem, just in the lines I've read. She's not even referred to by her proper name, just by it, My Last Duchess, as if it were an impersonal role, one of a series. It's sort of almost like My Latest Duchess, and in fact, the monologue here is addressed to an ambassador of the father of his next Duchess. Um, so female commodification and a kind of male homosociality, like it's between, she becomes a matter of a relationship between me and the painter, so the painter is named. So I want to look here at the first poem. This figure hath high price, 'twas wrought with love ages ago in finest ivory, majolica of deft design to please a lordly eye. The smile you see is perfect, wonderful as mere faience, a table ornament to suit the richest mounting. So there's a couple exotic words there. Proper names for styles of pottery, majolica and faience, faiancha. So again, it's interesting that the style of pottery are given distinctive names, whereas womanhood is generic. It's like currency. Eliot's poem is spoken from the perspective of a salesman or curator, and that's effectively what the speaker in Browning's poem is as well. That's in fact the point, is that men curate women. He notes in passing the final lines of the poem. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus von Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So it's just one of these various male-produced images, implicitly of conquest. Neptune taming a seahorse. And this, Eliot's poem also suggests hunting, mounting, worthy of richest mounting, mounting womanhood as if a trophy. Looking at the correlation between the two dead hands, Featherstone's and Casaubon's, I think we can see how Eliot is much more pointedly focusing on the sort of patriarchal violence and play in Casaubon's Dead Hand. That it's about taming womanhood, controlling, owning womanhood. It's really striking the extent to which Dorothea is sucked into Casaubon's paranoia. So notice how she second guesses herself when she bumps into Will at Lydgate's house. She sees him and she's like, "Oh, I got to get out of here. It would be Casaubon wouldn't like this." She had the sudden sense that there would be a sort of deception in her voluntarily allowing any further intercourse between herself and Will. So you see how she is internalizing his paranoia, and this even sort of infects her thinking about Will. She starts saying, "Well, maybe he's right about Will. Like, I'm not so sure. Perhaps I've been mistaken in many things," said poor Dorothea to herself, while the tears came rolling and she had to dry them quickly. And the image of Will, which had been so clear to her before, was mysteriously spoiled. She's internalizing this idea that her relationship with Ladislaw is a mistake. The very image of him, that crystal clear image, is spoiled. This goes to the heart of her feelings about him. So I think Will's reading of this situation is pretty on the nose. both in terms of noticing how this damage, this clouding, the spoiling the crystal clear image um, is so insidious, but it's nonetheless real. Damage to his relationship with Dorothea here. He's confronting prejudice as this insidious infection. He could write in clear defiance back to that letter, but outside of the text, in the real world, these attitudes, the prejudicial attitudes, are not so easy to contain or refute. Prejudices, like odorous bodies, have a double existence, both solid and subtle. Solid as the pyramids, subtle as the 20th echo of an echo, or as the memory of hyacinths which once scented the darkness. And Will was of a temperament to feel keenly the presence of subtleties. A man of clumsier perceptions would not have felt, as he did, that for the first time some sense of unfitness and perfect freedom with him had sprung up in Dorothea's mind, and that their silence as he conducted her to the carriage had a chill in it. Perhaps Casaubon, in his hatred and jealousy, had been insisting to Dorothea that Will had slid below her socially. Confound Casaubon. So he's basically right, I think. Both, I think, in blaming it on Casaubon, but he's also, I think, right in, even if it's a consequence of prejudice planted by Casaubon, it's nonetheless real. A sense of unfitness has tainted his relationship with Dorothea. So he's pointing out a change in mood, like it's not something that could just be corrected. There's been an organic change in the actual, feelings between the two. In chapter 44, there's some other powerful indications of Dorothea's internalization of Casaubon's paranoia. When she's talking to Lydgate, she'd like to provide some help and be involved in Lydgate's mission with the hospital, because she says everything of that sort has slipped away from me since I've been married. I mean, she said after a moment's hesitation, so she catches herself like, no, that's wrong. I'm not supposed to think that. Then chapter 44 ends with internal monologue of Casaubon's about his dire prognosis. It shows how the complete kind of communication breakdown. So they're just sort of communicating through paranoia rather than directly. She knows that I know, said the ever-restless voice within, but that increase of tacit knowledge only thrust further off any confidence between them. He distrusted her affection, and what loneliness is more lonely than distrust? What makes distrust so lonely? I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about Dorothea's social concern. It's a matter of keeping trust with society, so as to not feel so cut off. Doing justice, keeping trust to others. Questions of social trust come up in a lot of interesting ways in regard to medicine, the mistrust of medicine. The medical reform and political reform both turn on social trust, a kind of lack of self-trust on the part of both Lydgate and Ladislaw comes out when they have a debate about politics. Even as they're arguing their, theoretical position about politics and medicine, they're each have these kind of nagging, a little bit paranoid doubts that the other person is poking fun at their financial benefactor. So it's pretty interesting to see how these personal circumstances cloud political medical judgment, even in these two very earnest guys. They're letting their personal bad conscience take priority. I like how this argument ends with Rosamond commenting, "How very unpleasant you both are this evening. I cannot conceive why money should have been referred to. Politics and medicine are sufficiently disagreeable to quarrel upon." I like it when Rosamond's right. Like she's totally right there. She's calling out these guys who are used to being, the smartest ones around, especially relative to her. They're so condescending to her. Chapter 47 is definitely one of my favorites of the whole book. It's like an epic love poem, and it has some great poetry in it, including this epigraph, and a song that Will sings. And one of my favorite scenes, this lyricism is related to the kind of fairy tale motifs that we've been noticing, dissolving of the narrative into lyric poetry, experience of the divine that the narrator attributes to Will when he's admiring Dorothea's perfection that we talked about last time. And the narrator says, "I think Will is perfect too." Isn't that a funny thing for a narrator to say? I think he's perfect. His feeling of love is perfect. And how do you narrate perfection? You can't, right? That's what poetry's for. Again, like in the last book, she says all human beings have dreamy visions of possibilities. There's no human being who, having both passions and thoughts, does not think in consequence of his passions, does not find images rising in his mind which soothe the passion with hope or sting it with dread. So that's exactly the idea of the imagination is the brood of desire again. But she distinguishes what's going on with Will from this. But this, which happens to us all, happens to some with a wide difference. So she's drawing a distinction now. Will was not one of those whose wit keeps the roadway. It's a Shakespeare quotation. Roadway thief. So he's not using his imagination to sort of steal gratification. He had his bypass where there were little joys of his own choosing, such as gentlemen cantering on the high road might have thought rather idiotic. And this is foreshadowing. So his byway is idiotic, is foolish. It's not practical. And his song, his poetry, the song he sings walking along the high road is an example of this idiocy. I think one of the most beautiful moments in the book. But if chapter 47 is kind of an epic love poem, it's also a poem of ambivalence and confusion. I think at this point in the book, I think we're starting to get a picture about how radically confused everybody is about everybody else, how poor communication is. So this divine epiphany of love that Will experiences in this chapter, what occasions it? Well, it was that argument with Lydgate about politics and, and medicine. And paranoia, not unlike Casaubon's, is exhibited by Will. The difference is how they react to it, how they deal with it. so Casaubon burrows into his hole and devises plans of using his death to manipulate people. Will sings like an idiot walking down the road. But just notice how the train of thought that leads him to this action, the narrator calls it unreason. She calls it crazy. So let's see how this chapter starts off. It's with misgiving. He stayed up all night after that talk, with that little argument with Lydgate, because it pricked his conscience. He starts having a bad conscience about sticking around Middlemarch and relying on Brooke. Hesitations before he had taken the step had since turned into susceptibility to every hint that he would have been wiser not to take it. He is Any little indication, like in a completely uh, innocent argument with Lydgate, he takes personally as reason to question his reason for being in Middlemarch, which is his love for Dorothea. Hence his heat towards Lydgate, a heat which still kept him restless. Was he not making a fool of himself? So he's getting eaten up by these misgivings and kind of paranoia and guilt. But then he has these misgivings, but they always just lead him to reaffirm and believe in his foolish commitment. So the misgivings are part and parcel of the love. It's sort of that what I was talking about last time with the troublesome sprigs. That's sort of the point of the idealism is to bear the burden, the friction, tension with the real world. That's how you keep the crystal clear. It's about keeping your intentions clear, and you do that by challenging yourself in the world. Not making your mind submit to the world, not making your ambitions and desires submit to the world, your imagination submit to the world, but foolishly, idiotically upholds, again, what Keats called the negative capability, but willingness to live in mystery, uncertainty, and doubt. Will we know could not bear the thought of any flaw appearing in his crystal. He was at once exasperated and delighted by the calm freedom which Dorothea looked at him and spoke to him. And there was something so exquisite in thinking of her just as she was, that he could not long for a change which must somehow change her. I love that. Long for a change which must somehow change her. She's perfect as she is. I don't want to even dream about manipulating that. I don't want to reduce it to practical calculations. Don't we shrink from the news that the rarity may be obtained as an everyday possession? So exactly the opposite view of My Last Duchess, or the idea that womanhood may be mounted and possessed like a trophy. He's saying what makes it beautiful is precisely not possessing it. That's also how Keats talks about the negative capability as opposed to irritable grasping after fact and reason. So it's this kind of possessiveness. I think this is exactly what Eliot means in this key line. Our good depends on the quality and breadth of our emotion. An emotion that just clings to, wants to hold on to, understand, and control. That's a very meager and narrow emotion. An expansive, rich emotion is much more intuitive, uncertain, but so much more richly interactive. To will, a creature who cared little for what are called the solid things of life, and greatly for its subtler influences, to have within him such a feeling as he had towards Dorothea was like the inheritance of a fortune. That's the whole novel in a nutshell. Like, this is his fortune. It doesn't count in the material terms, the commercial terms of money. Indeed, what others might call the futility of his passion made an additional delight for his imagination. He was conscious of a generous movement. I'm letting go, enjoying my dream in a non-possessive way. He's learning here Dorothea's religion of loving what is good, not needing to have it for himself. That was the distinction between he and Dorothea in their conversation about religion. Is he wanted to love the beauty and the good when he saw it, when it was available to him. She, by contrast, loves the good whether we know what it is or not, whether we know how to enact it or not. She loves the good in spite of that insecurity, the mystery, and that's what he's embracing, the futility, the idiocy, that kind of comes natural to Dorothea. But that's her saintliness. She's always had that. So their education, their sentimental education, is sort of going in opposite directions. He's learning to be foolish, like comes to her naturally, where she's becoming more worldly. She's learning more practical lessons about what's worth her love, about what is good or not. It's really key here, I think, that last time the narrator was describing Will as divine. Something it's like even mortals are sometimes divine and perfect. Here she's emphasizing, like Keats, that it's equally just a matter of charming one's fancy. That I want to verify in my own experience the love poetry that charms my fancy. So what he emphasizes here is the superfluity, this generous impulse he feels. So if he could have written out in immortal syllables the effect she wrought within him, he might have boasted after the example of old Drayton. It's kind of cool. It's like he might not have the words, but he has the feeling. And what is that feeling? Queens hereafter might be glad to live upon the alms of her superfluous praise. Interesting contrast with the verse that began Book 5, where value is correlated with price. The value of womanhood and nobility are all correlated with price and ownership. Here, it's precisely the opposite. Queens, royalty, would be glad to live on what is superfluous, the overflow, the waste of the praise that I bestow on Dorothea. So the highest value is the superfluous joy and love that Will expresses here. So in this back and forth argument that he's having in his head about whether he's a fool, whether people think he's a fool for staying in Middlemarch, whether people think he's culpable in some way for lingering around, but he overrules that concern in the name of poetry, in the name of fantasy, feudal fairy tale. She had once said that she'd like him to stay, and stay he would, whatever fire-breathing dragons might hiss around her. I love that. He's making a fairy tale of his own life, or he's embracing his love of Dorothea because it allows him to live a fairy tale. So the epigraph to chapter 47 defends true love. It's the highest gain. Again, it's the highest value, but it's precisely because it's not owned, it's not the property of an individual, but it's part of the environment. It must spring where elements are fostering. No art can make it. It's an event in the world rather than just in myself. So in heaven's spot and hour springs the little native flower, downward root and upward eye, shapen by the earth and sky. So it's a kind of cosmic event. It's a way in which I see myself shaped by earth and sky. To feel life is in heaven's spot and hour. It's a divine place and time. To feel that divinity is not to understand it. To understand it would be to, abstract oneself out of it. And it goes back to Coleridge's Frost at Midnight. God will be a blessing to you in all things, and by giving make you ask. The gift is the mystery. The gift of life is not answers and assurances, but the mysterious abundance of the world. And that's what Will celebrates in this lovely song he sings. What frugal cheer my love doth feed upon. It needs so little. This is the generous impulse, the generous feeling. My love is overflowing. It takes so little. a touch, a ray that is not here. He's really speaking in romantic terms of the negative capability, the absence, um, a touch, a ray that is not here, a shadow that is gone. So it's just these things that I'm imagining. That's all I need to feed my love. A dream of breath that might be near, an inly echoed tone. Just like John Keats, he's feeding off the uncertainty. That's giving him power, kind of the capability, the kind of strength that comes from embracing that uncertainty rather than shrinking from it, when irritably wanting to hold on to things that in the end are impossible to control. Here, there is no object. He's not in the presence of the object of his love. It's let alone the perfect object. And he's singing about his absence. But these aren't mere abstract concepts of divinity or perfection. Here we have both the narrator and Will symptomatically expressing, bringing that divinity, that heaven, paradise to life in concrete terms, in time, in the world around him. And just notice also how the narrator is participating in it. She sees him as a vision of heaven. Will walked to Loic as if he'd been on the way to paradise, skirting the wood where the sunlight fell broadly under the budding boughs, bringing out the beauties of moss and lichen and fresh green growths piercing the brown. Everything seemed to know it was Sunday and to approve of his going to Loic Church. The environment itself is animated by the generous overflow of his love. Will went along with a small book under his arm and a hand in each side pocket, never reading, but chanting a little as he made scenes of what would happen in church and coming out. He was experimenting in tunes, so his face would break into its merry smile, pleasant to see as the breaking of sunshine on the water. Again, the narrator is enjoying Will as a spectacle. We've noticed that before. The first scene when Dorothy and Will are introduced, she talks about how pleasing the prospect of Will is. The narrator likens him to the breaking of sunshine on water. Again, very Keatsian. Keats's epitaph is, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." She's not just naming perfection or divinity, she's turning it into metaphors of concrete experience in the world, and then singing it. So I'll play someone who actually can sing.
Will went along with a small book under his arm and a hand in each side pocket, never reading, but chanting a little as he made scenes of what would happen in church and coming out. He was experimenting in tunes to suit some words of his own, sometimes trying a ready-made melody, sometimes improvising. The words were not exactly a hymn, but they certainly fitted his Sunday experience. Oh me, what frugal cheer my love doth feed upon. A touch, a ray that is not here, a shadow that is gone. A dream or breath that might be near, an illy echoed tone. The thought that one may think me dear, the place where one was known. The tremor of a banished fear, an ill that was not done. Oh me, what frugal cheer my love doth feed upon. Sometimes, when he took off his hat, shaking his head backward and showing his delicate throat as he sang, he looked like an incarnation of the spring whose spirit filled the air, a bright creature, abundant in uncertain promises. The bells were still ringing when he got to Lowick.
So he's an incarnation of spring in the narrator's eyes, a spirit filling the air from his delicate throat as he sang. So in lines like this, we see the narrator echoing, he's bearing witness to the same generous impulse in herself. She is telling us about seeing the spirit of spring, filling the air, abundant, uncertain promises. It's precisely what can't be narrated. It can't be nailed down to a certain story and understood, itemized, and causally explained. It's a feeling of faith that can only be transmitted through the contagion of a song, the contagion of the music of poetry and the metaphors of poetry are values that require negative capability. I think from this point in Middlemarch on, the interweaving of plot lines gets so complicated that you can begin to notice how totally random everything is. Just to take one example, Lydgate is persuaded by his allegiance to Bulstrode to vote against Fairbrother and Fort Tyke. And he did not do that for any considered reasons. He did it for stubborn, spur of the moment pride. But because of that choice, Lydgate is then especially motivated to do a favor for Fairbrother. And for that reason, among others, he speaks very highly of Fairbrother to Dorothea because he wants Dorothea to hire him in the Lowick living after Casaubon dies. And that just by chance leads him to speak about how fond Fairbrother's aunt, Mrs. Noble, is of Ladislaw. And that this image of Ladislaw with Miss Noble convinces Dorothea that her doubts about Ladislaw were misguided. It's an image that clears the crystal of Dorothea's view of Ladislaw and her love of him. One of the old ladies, Miss Noble, the aunt, is a wonderfully quaint picture of self-forgetful goodness, and Ladislaw gallants her about sometimes. I met them one day in a back street. You know Ladislaw's look, and this little old maid reaching up to his arm. They look like a couple dropped out of a romantic comedy. Not only does Lydgate drop this image in passing, inadvertently almost, he has no idea that this should have any relevance to Dorothea. But he's doing this all because of a choice that he initially made inadvertently that disadvantaged Fairbrother. So he's trying to make up for that. I mean, nothing has less to do with Dorothea than that. And yet it corrects her assessment of Will's character. These accidents, these total random accidents, are clearing the crystal of Dorothea's view of Will. So I think this is where we really see the web coming together, is how these chance events play a crucial role in plot lines. The plot lines are no longer governed by plausibility. So just notice the sequence of events that we see here in chapter 47. Will and Lydgate argue over politics, and it leaves both of them with a personal guilty conscience about things that don't have to do with the ostensible political argument. And so this is Eliot's realism. She shows up. People are talking about the reform bill, public concerns that are important, and we've been tracking how the reform bill is actually changing events. But often when they're talking about it, they're actually talking about these personal issues. That's what's in the forefront of their mind, that are only tangentially, accidentally related. So the guilty conscience for personal concerns that both Lydgate and Ladislaw are left with after their political argument causes these kind of pivotal events. So these qualms prompt Lydgate to rectify the damage he caused Fairbrother by voting for Tyke. By contrast, what do Will's qualms cause him to do? It caused him to double down. He has concerns about his allegiance to Brooke and hanging around Middlemarch, but they only strengthen Will's quixotic devotion to Dorothea. The moral concerns, the guilty conscience that he gets, actually confirms his resolution of his quixotic romanticism to saving Dorothea from the dragons. But this backfires. At least it seems to. So Will gets the cold shoulder at church from both Dorothea and Casaubon. He feels awful. He thinks Dorothea rejects him as much as Casaubon does. And it changes the lights both without and within. I love that. So again, the importance of mood as a inner psychological state, as well as an exterior atmospheric state. Mood describes both. The lights without and within are dimmed. They were sparkling like sunshine on the way to the church, but on the way back, everything's dimmed. It's a wonderful portrait of mood and how mood has a life of its own. Will is trying to argue himself in and out of different decisions, but it's all kind of dictated by mood. And the light is similarly drained from life for Dorothea. So Will is wrong in his assessment of Dorothea's reaction. He thinks she rejects him just as coldly as Casaubon, but in fact she was happy that he was there. She thought that it was generous of him to come, and that he and Casaubon could make up. Again, that shows how clueless Dorothea is about what's actually going on with Casaubon. So the fact that Casaubon refuses to acknowledge him is devastating for Dorothea. This is a really powerful description of her depression again. Books were of no use. Thinking was of no use. It was Sunday and she could not have the courage to go to Celia, who had lately had a baby. It's a interesting line. It's like newborn nephew is kind of irrelevant. It's just only important because it might distract me from my depression a little bit. That's how, in contrast to the image of spring, of life emerging outside everywhere, life is deadened. There was no refuge now from spiritual emptiness and discontent. And Dorothy had to bear her bad mood as she would have borne a headache. That's really powerful. Description, so of existential emptiness and just physical burden, the headache. She stood by the door of the tomb and seen Will Ladislaw receding into the distant world of warm activity and fellowship, turning his face towards her as he went. It's another sort of romantic image. She's getting sucked into the tomb. Her saviors walking away. Her life, henceforth, as a kind of tomb, servicing the key to all mythologies as itself a kind of tomb. It's a kind of fantastical fairy tale image, but it's correct. It's a correct representation of what she's signed up for. In that way, it's realistic. Like I was saying before, the romantic terms in which she imagines Will, something she was so thirsty for. That sounds fantastical on the one hand, but it's actually a realistic representation of the desperation of her predicament. and Casaubon's cruelty and how suffocating that relationship is to her. These fantastical images are ways of registering that reality. Casaubon is cruel, but it's not unrealistic representation of marriage. I mentioned to you that Freud said acknowledged that he learned something about his own marriage from Eliot's representation of Dorothy and Casaubon's relationship. Indeed, she's talking about kind of hostility to life that it stems from patriarchy in general. Casaubon resents Dorothea for being alive, and he has engaged Dorothea in a commitment to edit the Kedar mythologies. So again, Dorothea's right to think of herself as getting sucked into this tomb because Casaubon's really um, locking down Dorothea's life. And this weirdly energizes him. He wakes her in the middle of the night. I'm wakeful. My mind is remarkably lucid. And Dorothy's scared, and rightly. I mean, it sounds like this is what causes his death. It's this overexcitement, as imprisoning Dorothea in this tomb. I fear the excitement may be too great for you. It recalls Ladislaw's image of Casaubon crunching bones in his cavern. I think that describes this morbid appetite that energizes him now. Dorothea was amazed by the bird-like speed with which his mind was surveying the ground where it had been creeping for years. And this excitement leads up to this ultimate request that Dorothea should carry out my wishes, that you'll avoid doing what I deprecate and apply yourself to doing what I should desire. Dorothea was not surprised by this request. Things seemed to be leading up to it. She hesitates, saying it's too solemn. I don't think it's right to make a promise when I'm ignorant what it will bind me to. Whatever affection prompted, I would do without promising. Isn't that the point of, marriage or, love? That's it right there. And he's saying, no, you should not use your own judgment. You should obey mine. It's thorough ownership. And here, no, dear, no, says Dorothea beseechingly, crushed by opposing fears. She's crushed. So he's totally got her in this bind, which is like that image of crunching bones. He's just coercively entombing her. And she ultimately resolves to make that promise. Devote her life to serving what killed him. But I think the point for Dorothea, though, is that the pledge means everything. Her honesty and integrity mean everything. So I think if she, once she discovered that he wasn't just asking her to promise to work on the Kedar mythologies, but was also promising to remain faithful to him after his death, I think she would have felt bound by that. And so it's only a matter of chance that she escaped that total entombment. That Casaubon happened to die, minutes before she was about to give that promise. Another example of the importance of, random chance. But interestingly, even though she avoids making that promise, whatever degree of freedom she has from him also revolts her. Even with indignation against him in her heart, any act that seemed a triumphant eluding of his purpose revolted her. So he's infected her still. Her devotion to serving him, serving his paranoia, lingers with her. But I think the revelation of his, how little he understood her, how poor their communication was, and how mean and mistrustful he was of her. I think these strengthen Dorothea and give her the courage to turn him down, and posthumously write him this letter saying, Can't you see that I can't devote my life to something I don't believe in because you didn't believe in it. You're asking me to prop up a charade that you didn't believe in yourself. But what she does believe in is Miss Noble. When Lydgate was gone, his picture of Ladislaw lingered in her mind. What was Ladislaw thinking about her? Would he hear of the fact which made her cheeks burn as they never used to do? And how would he feel when he heard it? But she could see as well as possible how he smiled down at the little old maid. He was a creature who entered into everyone's feelings. An Italian with white mice. That's how Miss Cadwallader characterized him. Again, using this kind of animalistic, carnivalesque imagery. But Dorothy is really recognizing, she's recognizing the class prejudice that images like this conceal, and she's recognizing the cruelty, the problem of neighborliness that I was talking about last time, the lack of neighborliness, the inhuman lack of neighborliness that class prejudice is. This image of him with Miss Noble, like a couple dropped out of a romantic comedy, that fanciful image restores Dorothy's faith in Will's character. He was a creature who entered into everyone's feelings and could take the pressure of their thought instead of urging his own with iron resistance. Iron is sort of a image of control. Featherstone had his iron lockbox with his money in it. The iron grate in front of the banker's desk. Rig wants to sit behind an iron lattice. So we can see, Casaubon's iron will for control overlapping with this coercive use of money as control, and juxtaposition of two kinds of will. The will as a legal document, like coercive, like iron, trying to control people, entomb people. On the other hand, the will as a will to dream, negative capability, keeping the crystal of idealism clear, which also means will, like willful. Will also has a connotation of accident, an openness to accidents, unpredictability. I think that's what's key about the negative capability as a power, an ability. It's an ability to withstand worldly accidents, to not be scared of them, to welcome them as gifts, means of discovering, finding out, as Dorothea puts it, finding out what my religion really is, finding out what the ideal means. The world keeps showing, reminding and teaching what that ideal is about. A couple dropped out of a romantic comedy also describes Fairbrother and Mary. One of the most poignant scenes is Fairbrother's pleading Fred's case for Mary. I don't know what to think about it. It's hard not to wish that Mary would go with Fairbrother. But what's I think striking is Fred doesn't seem worthy of either of these two people. But what's striking is how both of them are devoted to their ideal. Mary says, I can't imagine not giving up on Fred. He's been with me. He married me with the umbrella ring. So again, another example of a sort of fairy tale ideal dictating really serious moral choices. And Fairbrother likewise, he might be, in our assessment, overdoing his generosity and friendship, but I think that's an ideal that he needs to keep true